Hello and welcome to this Mastering the Machine webinar for February 19th, 2021. Our guest today is Doug Alward, Senior Applications Engineer at Wright Industries, retired, and he is going to be telling us a little bit more about quoting machines and machine specifications. Hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started now. Again, this is the Mastering the Machine webinar. My little group is called the Automation Academy, and we have a few kind of permanent members inside, and then we have a pretty good sized Facebook group and some people follow on LinkedIn, that sort of thing. Go ahead and show a couple of these things. What is this Mastering the Machine? In 2013, and I'm going to talk a little more about this, I put out a document called Mastering the Machine, and the general idea was it was what they call an opt-in incentive or a lead magnet. It was to get me some traffic on my website. So lots of people have downloaded it, and what it covers is machine building and documenting. At that time, I was fresh out of Wright Industries, where Doug and I both worked long ago. Well, maybe not as long ago for Doug, but I was kind of fresh out of that, and I had learned how all the quoting and putting together of these large systems worked. I was there for about 6 years, and then before that, I ran my own little tiny machine building company. So I've been in machine building for a long time, but I learned a lot at Wright, how they do things kind of formally. So I put together this document, and I'm going to show you just a little piece of that document here. So hopefully you can see that. And this is what people download from my site. And what it does is it explains from the machine builder standpoint how machines are planned, built, documented. It doesn't go so much into the sales thing, but it goes into a lot of the documentation. So I talk about primary documents and secondary documents that require the use of the first documents, right? And then third level documents, things like that. And then I talk about concepting the system, and I mentioned some of the different documents. And Doug may know about other documents that I didn't put in here, but this was from my perspective back then. So requirements documents, product specs, plant specs right from the plant. They're a lot of times pinned to the requirements documentation. And then I go through the different quote requests and vendor qualification. And then this is kind of the key from my standpoint. This is part of my, I guess, sales pitch, is I tell people that you can do things in-house, right? And you can buy your own components. And sometimes that's where I get to help people out. So the last Mastering the Machine that Doug and I did, I talked about a food vendor in Knoxville, food products vendor, and where I was just getting started with them, specifying a system and helping them put the quote requests and things together, specifying the machine. And so kind of where I'm at with them is they don't have a lot of in-house capability, but because it's in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is my old stomping grounds, this is the kind of stuff that I would have done back when I owned my own company down there. And so I know a lot of people that build individual machines, that build. One company is even a large conveyor integrator, but they also make all the individual little conveyor parts. So when it comes time to put the conveyors into this thing, they could build their own conveyors, right? Just buying bits and pieces if they wanted to, but it requires a lot of internal resources, which this company doesn't have. But then there's a way to do it kind of in between and say, okay, I'm going to use this machine shop, and I'm going to use this conveyor vendor, and I'm going to use this systems integrator, right? But then somebody needs to coordinate all that. And then there's the third option, which is where Doug and I work together, which is turnkey. It's the highest cost, but your resources aren't very high, right? As a manufacturer or a company, a plant, you just turn it all over to a great big machine builder and they'll do everything for you. But there's some overhead that is associated with that, right? So they have project managers, they're doing runoffs of machines, even machines that they may buy them, like vibratory bowls or packaging machines, and they really didn't build them, right? But they're marking that up and they're doing the runoffs for them, which costs money and travel and all that. So that's kind of the concept behind the Mastering the Machine original document that I put together here. And then I talk about, controls architecture, things like that. This is something I use in some of my own presentations, and then have some printouts of, Microsoft Project, that sort of thing, and talk about how all those things are put together: mechanical design, electrical and controls design, go through all that. And by the end of the document, I've kind of told people how all that process works. Sometimes you get into FDA validation, which we had to do a lot of that at Wright Industries, right, for medical products, pharmaceuticals, whatever. And all this has to be taken into account. And then I give people a little documentation checklist at the end and say, do you have all of these documents, or do you even require them, right? Do you need those kind of documents? So that's where this came from. And then where did the idea of this little course or this webinar come from? The feedback within the Automation Academy mentioned that a lot of the people were not there for PLC programming classes, even though that's what I started it for. They were there for learning about systems integration for me. So I've now migrated much of what I do in the Automation Academy into systems integration, and all the details associated with it, including PLC and HMI programming. I still have a lot of courses on there, but I have started a course called Mastering the Machine. It only has one module so far. It was based on the last webinar that we did, which is the feasibility study for a food products manufacturer. And the second course will be on quoting and machine specifications, which is what we're talking about here today. So the topic of today's webinar is quoting machine specifications, and our host for that is going to be Doug Alward, who worked at Wright Industries when I worked there. You can see he worked there 1997 to 2017. I was there about 2006 to 2012, but I got to work with Doug on some of the applications and learned a little bit about some of the spreadsheets and things that we use there. And I actually have a copy of one of those. Doug may be showing some of this stuff, but they're really detailed, right? There were a lot of things that went into figuring out all the parts that were going to be included in a project. And I got to work with applications somewhat, although most of my responsibility was doing controls design, a little bit of project control stuff, and programming, quite a bit of that. So that's my background. And on that note, I am going to turn the screen sharing over to Doug. Stop share. There we go. And there's just the three of us on the screen.
So you can see my screen presently?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I struggle sometimes with Zoom, so I apologize. I might need some assistance, but in putting together what Frank is led into here and going on, I kind of wanted to address this from two different perspectives. One would be the smaller integrator that, maybe a 20-man shop or something like that, and then versus the large integrators that are out there in the world. But there's some consistencies between the two in that, number one, obviously nothing happens until something is sold. And that's very important because you need to keep that monster fed. And, if you're not booking work, then there's no need to have people in supply chain. There's no need to have people in accounting. You've got to have work, bookings, solid bookings, consistent bookings, to keep all of that revenue stream steady. And one of the problems with the smaller companies is generally the owner or the people at the top are wearing multiple hats. So when they're out selling and soliciting business and going after business, they're not back in the office generating revenue. And vice versa, when they're back in the office generating revenue, they're not out selling. So it tends to become a cyclic type of revenue stream for their businesses, where some days they've got a lot of business and the next day they're saying, oh, we're falling off the cliff. We don't have enough backlog to keep the people busy. So it's a balance that you have to have between sales and operations to make sure that you're generating enough bookings and enough backlog that you're meeting those monthly requirements and your overhead, keeping things going, and you're not getting into positions where you got to lay people off, or be out hiring, looking for people because you're swinging so bad. My experience has shown me that what wins proposals is basically 4 different items. Whether this be a formal request for quotation that you got from a company that's got a huge internal resource and can generate great user requirement specifications, or you're dealing with a company that Frank was making mention to over there in Knoxville, where they don't have a lot of internal resources, so they didn't generate it. Maybe they've got a PowerPoint presentation that's describing their thing. But what wins those proposals gets down to these 4 things. And number 1, you've got to have a good concept. So when the requirement comes in, if your concept isn't right, nothing else is going to matter. And you've got to have a relationship with the customer. Oftentimes they're new customers. You've got to build that relationship. And the best way to build that relationship is as you're developing the concepts, keeping constant communications open with them, and showing the concepts to them as you're developing it, and getting their buy-in as you're going. They'll coach you if you have that relationship. They'll coach you towards the concept, what it needs to be, and say, oh no, we don't do things that way. Get rid of that robot and put a pneumatic pitch in place because we don't have the skill sets internally to support that. So you're building the concept that they like, rather than keeping them out of the picture and submitting your proposal later, and they look at it and they say, well, this isn't the way we do things. You're building that relationship. They depend upon you. They're seeing that you're responsive. They're seeing that you're accepting their input and their comments. And when you have those 2, it kind of takes the other 2 out of the equation a little bit. If you don't have those 2, all you have is price and delivery, and that's only the selection process that you're going to be able to compete with. And if you're competing solely in price and delivery, you're not going to have a profitable business. The money, you can generally, with a good concept and a good relationship, you can generally be 10 to 15% higher on price, and you can generally not be the best absolute delivery in terms of putting the product into their facility. You got to remember that the people that you're working with when you're establishing these relationships are sticking their neck out on the line as well, because they're going to their team and their manager saying, hey, I really want to do work with company XYZ because these guys have had the best concept. They've been the most responsive in terms of getting questions back to me, in terms of identifying all the different things that we have to do, and having an open, transparent relationship. What's most important in preparing a proposal? Again, you've got to go through a thorough review of the documents. Oftentimes you might receive a user requirement specification and it walks down the particulars for that application. But when you get to the back in the appendix, it'll make reference to 10 or 15 or 20 other documents like UL 508 or GAMP 5 or other things that aren't specific in the user requirement specification, but are referenced that you have to meet in terms of the overall project. And you've got to be aware of those documents, and you've got to read those documents so that what you're putting together will meet those requirements as well. I think it's really important as well that you brainstorm with peers internally. It's important to talk to the customer if you're developing concepts, but there's no substitute for going into a room on a whiteboard and sitting down with some of your colleagues and walking through a problem and soliciting their opinions as well, and working together to develop that particular solution that's necessary. You have to have a toolbox. And what I mean by that is that you've got to have a source that you can go to leverage existing designs, to leverage existing pricing, to leverage existing projects that you did a particular thing and you know exactly what the hours were that were required to achieve that. And by using a toolbox and by having a toolbox, you're significantly reducing your risk on the application because you've got known things that work and you're not starting with a clean sheet of paper on everything. And that leads into identifying the risks. You're not always going to have the solution to meet every requirement that the customer has. And oftentimes you've got to go back and tell them that and say, listen, this is a risk to us. We think we can do it, but we're recommending we first do a proof of principle to mitigate that risk. And it may take a little bit of time up front, but it'll save us both time and money later so that we don't get to the assembly floor later and debug and find out, oh, this really doesn't work like we thought it was going to be. And then finally, again, constant communication with the customer. They have to see you and they have to view you as an extension of their own internal resources. And when they do that, you're a team member on their team as well. And they will support you and they will, behind the scenes, put your company ahead of the other companies. And again, it takes that price out of the equation. You don't always have to be the lowest price just to win the work. So what we do in terms of steps that we go through, again, a thorough review of the documentation, in understanding the documentation and reviewing all the different specifications that they're making reference to. You develop that initial concept or concepts. You review them with the customers for buy-in. You then start doing cycle time charts on the individual stations to ensure that for a particular rate you're trying to achieve, whether it be 120 parts per minute or 300 parts per minute or whatever it is, the individual stations are able to achieve that. Because again, in any application, your output, your OEE is only going to be as good as the worst station there. So if you've got some stations that are running at a 2-second tack, but you've got one that's at a 6, you need those cycle time charts to identify that up front so that again, you can answer that and get it down. If you've got time, and you generally don't, but you need to do simulations as well. We do a lot of simulations with robots, making sure that the robot's got the proper reach, it's got the right time cycle to do the reach that it needs. Where possible, you need to get updated prices from vendors, and that includes delivery. Especially right now with COVID, everybody's busy. And vendors are taking advantage of that and pricing. You're going to see price increases and you're going to see extended deliveries and trying to obtain feeder bolts or trying to obtain linear motor tracks or something like that. So you might have a good database that you can pull from to put together the quotation, but you've got to take some time to update some of those major commercial items. You've got to prepare a project schedule. Frank showed you the Microsoft project example on the screen. And not only is that schedule detailing what you're going to do and when you're going to do it, but you also, very much important, have to include on those schedules what the customer is responsible to do. If they're supplying you with piece parts so that you can go and get the vibratory bowls tooled and made, you need to clearly have that on your project schedule, the quantity and the date that has to be received. If they've got a functional requirement specification that has to be signed off, you've got to clearly have that on your schedule so that if they don't hit those dates, you've got some leverage because the project's dates are going to move. So you've got some leverage to negotiate with them and say, wait a minute, we clearly identified to you that you had to do this as well and you didn't do it. You prepare the cost worksheets, and I've got one that I'll show you as well that actually goes back to the same time frame that Frank was making reference to when Wright Industries was actually owned by Dorfer companies. And I'll show you that spreadsheet. And then you've got to go through and prepare the proposal document. And generally, that's a Word document. It's 50 or 60 pages. It's got an executive summary in the front that'll, in 1 or 2 pages, provide them with the bullets that says, hey, the overall price is this, the delivery is this, a general description of what's going on. And then the rest of the proposal goes into the detail in terms of the description of the station, the costing, the assumptions, the clarifications, all those other things that a senior manager is not going to take the time to read, but it is a document that you can use to protect yourself as well, because there's going to be scope creep. There's going to be changes that the project's going through, and you need a good document that you can always go back to 3 months later from now when people change or different people get assigned to the job and say, yeah, you're right. What you're describing here, you need, but let's refer back to what we quoted originally. That was not part of the scope, and it gives you the basis for which you can start doing engineering change orders if the customer starts having the scope creep. And then finally, you need to go through internal reviews and approval processes so that you're not committing the company's resources and the company's assets to something that nobody else has seen, and it comes to them as quite a surprise. One of the things I skipped over quickly, and I apologize, was additionally, there's different types of proposals, and each one of these requires a significantly larger investment in order to achieve it. I mean, some customers might come to you and just want a swag, which is just a wild guess. Hey, we think we want to build this machine. What do you think it looks like in terms of dollars so that we can put it into our budget for next year? We don't even have authorization, but we just want to put some budget numbers together. What do you think it should be? So you spend maybe a day on it, looking through it, and just throwing some real rough numbers together. The next step is called a rough order of magnitude, or a ROM. My personal feeling is if you spend more than 3 days on a ROM, then you're wasting the company's resources. Rough order of magnitudes, again, are things that you're putting in front of the customer. It's generally not a 50-page Word document proposal. It's a 5-page PowerPoint, and it puts the highlights of things on there, and it gives them a price of plus or minus 15% or plus or minus 20%. But you're going to a process where you're trying to get to the dance floor without taking a lot of time and without spending a lot of the company's money, only to find out that they come back and they say, well, we don't have that much money to spend anyhow. Then a budgetary. Oftentimes we'll do budgetaries up front, again, because it takes less time and less effort. But again, it's something you can start putting numbers that are not such a wild swing of plus or minus 20%, but it also has additional detail. You'll have a Word document that describes things in this. And then finally, the fixed price. We would never accept an order on the first 3. The first 3 are always just to be working with the customer to get to the money. If you do want to take an order, it's got to be a fixed price quotation. It's got to have the right terms and conditions, clearly identified, the payment terms, everything associated with it. And I would say that, again, a swag you can do in 1 day. A rough order of magnitude you could probably complete in 3 days. A budgetary might take you a week to 2 weeks. But in my experience, and these are generally projects that are larger, like $5 to $20 million type projects, it's going to take you at least a month to get a fixed price quotation together. By the time you go out to the vendors and get their responses and do everything and get through all the internal reviews, it's probably a good 4 weeks of time, of somebody's time and effort, multiple people getting involved. So again, that's quite a commitment for a company, especially if you're a smaller company. You don't get paid for quotations. So you're putting a lot of time and effort into something that you hope that you can get rewards from. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. So Frank had showed you a spreadsheet, and back when it's funny from the time for Dan's purpose here, from the time that I started at Wright Industries in 1997 until I retired, we went through 5 different owners. The company started out being a privately held company Fred Wright started the company many years ago, and then his son-in-law, Bailey Robinson, took over. And back in 1998-ish, we had revenues at that time, about $200 million annual revenues. And we had 5 locations in Nashville, 1 in Phoenix, and they employed over 800 people. And then right around 2001, and we were doing, we were pretty diversified in terms of vertical markets. We were doing a lot of work as well in the nuclear area for remediation and reprocessing fuel rods and processing waste products. And right around 2001, there was a company out of England called Robotic Technical Systems, RTS. And RTS did a lot of work in the UK with the British people in terms of nuclear applications. They wanted to expand those nuclear applications to the United States because it's a much larger marketplace, but they couldn't do it. You have to be a U.S. citizen, and there's laws and rules that have to be. So they came to Bailey Robinson, who was the sole owner of Wright Industries at that time, and said, "We want to buy your company." And he said, "Well, I didn't know it was for sale." And they said, "Well, how's $170 million?" He said, "Sold." So that was when we went from Wright Industries into RTS. In the subsequent 3 years, RTS took us from a $200 million annual revenues and 800 employees down to less than $40 million a year. And I think we were down at one point to like 240 employees. They just brought it was very similar to the German people. We would go into meetings with customers, and the customers would be negotiating and saying, "Well, we really need a lead time of 26 weeks. What can you do to help us with this? You're quoting 30 weeks. And these people from RTS would be arrogant. They'd just stand up and say, "That's your problem. You should have come to us 4 weeks ago. We wouldn't be having this discussion." You know, and it just alienated our customer base completely. So, you know, they had lost so much money that they were going to close down Wright Industries. It got to that point, the board of directors at RTS said, "Shut it down." And Bailey Robinson got involved, said, "If you shut it down, you will have so many lawsuits, both from the employees, from the customers, from the community. You won't get out of this." And he introduced them to Senator Subbarayan and Dave Takis, who owned Dorfer Companies. And Dorfer Companies had TDS Automation out in Waverly, Iowa. They had Williams White. They were a privately held company. They were doing acquisitions and growing. He introduced the Dorfer Companies to RTS. And what RTS paid $170 million for, Dorfer ended up paying $12 million for. And they even talked RTS into financing it. They didn't even pay cash. They said, "Okay, we'll pay you $12 million and we'll pay it to you over X period of time." And RTS, being a publicly traded company in the UK, all of this stuff was public. You could read it and you could see it going on. It was hilarious. Dorfer, Dave Takis and Senator Subbarayan were really good businessmen. They saw that RTS was in trouble, and they actually quit paying the loan and renegotiated it for 50 cents on the dollar. So they ended up paying $6 million instead of 12. So you got to give them some credit for that. But at the time, there was also a company, a part of the Dorfer organization called Advanced Automation over in Greenville, South Carolina. And Jennifer Cowden was one of the application engineers over there, and she developed this worksheet that you see here on the screen. And it's really it's really a great tool in that it identifies all the major segments of your labor internally, whether it be project management, mechanical design, electrical design, programming, electrical assembly, mechanical assembly, miscellaneous, like if you had FDA validation people or QA people involved, that was one of the miscellaneous. Fabrication, if you have a shop and you're machining your own internal parts, it automatically, as you go through here, will assign hours to each of those disciplines based upon the content that you put on each one of these sheets, as well as you can put in fab materials. So for example, here you see on this one line, you've got 618 hours for the shop to fab those parts, and you've got $13,000 it costs to go buy the materials, get the plating, get the, you know, any treatment that has to be done to them. And so the total in terms of the fabrication is an extension of the hours times the internal burdened rate cost plus the fab materials. And that's what you're seeing here with the 5620. And then if there's commercials, if you're purchasing commercials, they go here. So you have a total cost, you have a baseline, and then with the profit margins and such, you have the selling price. The spreadsheet was set up really well in that it had above line tasks, like for overall system, and then the platforms themselves. And then they had what we call below the line cost, where you get into debug and FATs, tear down and skidding, if you're doing shipping, as well as, installation, startup, customer training, any of those things that you do post shipment, and then some overall system costs. And then at the very bottom, it would summarize all of that for you. So if you wanted to know on this particular project that's has a cost of 1.1 million, and a sell price of 1.5, the program management group has a total of 637 hours to execute that project. So you can see the totals across here for each one of the disciplines, as well as the cost dollars. And you can also then start looking at some of the ratios. Used to be a good rule of thumb was that your purchase parts and fabrication would be 60% of the project price, and your internal labor would be 40% of the project price. So you can start looking at these ratios down before. And here, this one, you can see it's pretty close to that. It's 54% purchase and fab, and it's 45% roughly in labor. So a lot of times when you go through some internal reviews, the management's not going to understand the detail level that you have in here. They start looking immediately at these ratios, and that's what they get comfortable with because that's what they're used to seeing. So the program actually has a lot of macros that it's running, and I don't have the macros anymore that enable it, but you can actually go in and create these individual detail sheets. So you would go and set up empty platform, you would invoke one of those macros, and it will create this detail sheet you see before and give you the link. So in terms of overall, for example, if I jump to overall, you can put in here just different things like I've got to do design reviews, I've got to do vendor reviews, and again, put some hours in these buckets for the different tasks so that you identify what the overall is. When you start with the different stations, you can again see some of the detail that Frank was saying before. So obviously, from the mechanical's perspective, when you're building a custom piece of machinery, you've got to have a machine base, you've got to have guarding, and there's a tremendous database called Quote Resources that went with this, so that you could actually open Quote Resources and they'd have a detail sheet for machine bases, they'd have a detail sheet for controls, they'd have a detail sheet for vibratory feeder. There's like 50 different detail sheets. You could open that up and you could select this particular base and you could link it. You could just hit a key and it would automatically import all of that information from Quote Resources that previously had been established and approved by the internal groups so that you could quickly put these in and plug these in together. Like the guarding, for example, that was all in there. You could bring it in, you could say, I need 6 of them. It automatically pulls in the hours and then extends all the hours and the pricing for 6. And it walks right down, you walk right down through, again, a lot of different detail that goes into it from an in-feed platform. You do that mechanically. We do the same thing for controls. You've got your main cabinet, you've got a server cabinet in this instance, you've got a stack light. This looks like it's had a back-off IPC with a cyber research HMI running Indusoft. You've got remote IO. Again, this is all in Quote Resources, and you could pull it in based upon, Frank had showed you that controls architecture drawing. You would develop that just like you would do a concept drawing mechanically, and then use that as almost a checkoff as you're going through here and putting all these things in so you make sure that you don't miss something in the pricing. And then assigning labor hours. you've got different things with respect to, you've got to do recipe selection that wasn't, covered in hours up here. You can start assigning hours to that. And again, then it pulls it all back to this summary sheet so that as you put that detail in the control sheet, it's summarizing it here so that management can see it. If you do when you get into debug, again, there's already sheets that are developed so that you can say, okay, this particular machine is going to take so many weeks. If it's 6 weeks, see the hours automatically being updated. Or if it's going to take 9 weeks. And again, you can manually go through here and adjust that. Say, well, no, this one's going to really need 2 controls engineers because it's got a heavy database or something for a period of 9 weeks to debug. And again, it updates all of this automatically, imports it back to the summary sheet. So that again, you've got that broke out. And each one of these works just that way. And again, I apologize because I couldn't find the macros to actually open one of these up and run it for you. And I couldn't find a copy of the quote resources database that went with it. But again, it was an internal tool that was developed by Jennifer Cowden and then updated. The quote resources was a manual device that pricing, for example, when Rockwell had a price increase on PLCs, you had to go in manually and update each one of the PLCs that were in quote resources, like the compact logics or control logic. Each one of those had to be manual updated. It's since evolved to where it's actually linked into SAP, and as supply chain is buying items, it automatically updates quote resources so that as applications people or project teams will use this as well for engineering change orders. As they're going in and selecting things, perhaps they go in and buy, they need to add a Duquesne welder. They can go into quote resources, see the Duquesne welders that are available, and the most recent prices from when that was purchased will automatically appear in there for them. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a lot more than I knew about what was going on in the background.
Yeah, and again, the worst thing that you could have internally as a systems integrator, worse than no business, is having bad business. I mean, it does you no good to have an order in-house that you're losing money on, and you're occupying your skill sets that could be on a profitable job. So you really need to do some good due diligence up front and make sure that this budget not only is competitive and can win you the work, but you've caught all of the points that you possibly could. And it never will be perfect. You're going to have some things that are you underquoted. Oh, they really took 600 hours on laser platform. And you're going to have things that you overquoted. Oh, they only needed 100 hours on mechanical assembly. But in the end, what you're really concerned about is maintaining that margin, trying to avoid degradation to that margin. So again, there'll be pluses and minuses. It's never going to be perfect, but you're trying to best do that. There were also some links in here. Again, I don't have the macros, but you could put in here the number of weeks on a heel-to-toe type of schedule, and it would automatically, based upon the company rate you picked and the sell price, it would create a cash flow for you so that you can see if you're going to be cash neutral or if you're going to, not be cash neutral in terms of the standard payment terms that you might have established with that customer. And we always try to stay just cash neutral. We didn't want to be, funding the project for the customer, nor did we want the customer funding the project for us.
Typically, what were the terms for large projects like this to the customer?
Most projects in Dorfer days were 30, 30, 30, 10. 30% with the order, 30% with the commercial purchase of major commercials, 30% at startup or debug, and then 10% at SAT. Some of the terms would be, like, for example, the upfront might be 30% with the order net 10, and on the commercials, it might be 30% with the commercials net 30. So there were different things in terms of payment terms as well. Today's business climate, unfortunately, everything is net 90, which I don't understand, but that's generally how it would go. And some customers would want to hold back more than that 10% on the end, so you'd have to adjust it. They'd want to have 20% before they had SAT completed.
I worked with both the 30-30-30-10, and before that 40-40-20. And a lot of times some companies would not get, they would just build in the fact that they weren't going to get their final 10%. I know of one in particular in Cookeville that it's a small company, and they just kind of build that in. They know, well, we do a good job. We're pretty relatively inexpensive, you know, but they're also not super detail oriented. So they just know that final payment's probably not going to come, and documentation is their weak spot. Particular case. So,
yeah, a lot of them today, in fact, with you know, the current owner of Wright Industries, they'll actually put cost of money on the proposals, so that, you know, if the customer is not agreeing to 30-30-30-10, based upon this project schedule and based upon when the money is going to hit, they'll add cost of money to fund the project because you're not cash neutral. Very common to do that today as well.
okay. Yeah, because the net 90, you're right. I don't know that I have a customer that's not net 90 now, which is painful. You have to build something in ahead of time.
And what does it achieve? I mean, the liability to them isn't going away. And it's not like interest rates are at 10 or 12%, where sitting on the money does them any good.
Well, and the customer or the vendor is going to raise their prices based on that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
You mentioned leveraging the toolbox. I imagine after you've been doing it for a long time, you have a pretty big toolbox. What would you suggest for smaller companies that honestly, you know, they have one person that's making all the decisions? It's hard for them to have peer reviews because they don't really have other people necessarily working there that have a lot of experience. You know, and they haven't done enough jobs to have a big toolbox. Of course, you have the internet. You do have the web. You can look things up, I suppose, somewhat.
I think that I can go just some of my experience in the background. Before I came to Wright Industries, I also, we started a controls integrator company in 1986, and we sold it in 1991, I think. And it was strictly controls, but it had grown to the point where we were doing some small mechanical design and builds. And back in those days, I think we had a $100,000 line of credit with M&T Bank in Buffalo, New York. And they didn't want to extend it because it was prime +2. And they essentially said, why should we loan you money at prime +2 when we get 15% on credit cards? You know, so you understand it. So that's essentially why we sold it. But back at that time, similar things. We were a smaller company. I think it was 20 people. We were doing about $3 million in revenues. And I was doing all of the quoting. And the operations people, the people who had to live with it, obviously thought that the hours weren't sufficient. And so we did one of two things. We called in a consultant and said, would you look over these numbers and tell us what you think based upon your experience in the marketplace and the scope of this project? And the second thing we did was I kind of sat down all the employees in a conference room one day and said, we have this request for quotation from National Forge Company to retrofit the controls on these large presses that are making crankshafts for General Electric. You guys are going to quote it. And you guys understand that if we don't win this work or if we lose our bookings, there's going to be layoffs. we can't afford to carry this company if we're just throwing hours at stuff and we're not competitive. So if you're not happy with where we're quoting now, giving you everything you want, here's your opportunity. You quote it. That meeting ended in 20 minutes. They didn't want to have anything to do with quoting. And I don't think it was from the perspective of, that they would get laid off if they didn't work and such. I don't think most people that are in operations and really responsible for, doing initial mechanical design and doing program, I don't think they're comfortable quoting. They're just not used to it, and they're not comfortable doing it. And we had that at Wright, Frank, a lot of times when, we have too much in the incoming quotes, and we try to go to operations and get some assistance in quoting. They were very, very helpful in developing concepts and doing things, but when it came to pricing, they just weren't comfortable with, saying it takes this many hours to do this or this many hours to do that. And it takes a different group, and I would recommend going to an outside consultant.
Okay. Yeah. When I started out, I started kind of like you were talking about as a controls house and just building panels. And that was pretty easy to quote. I could, get my materials together or even get the customers to buy materials. And after you'd done a few, you knew how long it took to build the stuff. Programming was the same way. It would take you a certain amount of time to write programs. So as I grew that, I got a good feel for that. And then I started foraying into machine building. And that's where all of a sudden my schedules often slipped, because when I started out, I'd either build frames out of extrusion, and then you had to calculate, well, how long does it take you to get all the parts? And by the way, you're not going to have a lot of the parts. You're going to be missing some, so you're going to have to go buy them after the fact. You didn't build them in up front. So, and then also welded frames, things like that, where you're going to outside vendors. That became a big time sucker. So all of a sudden my schedules, I'd quote, 3 months, and I'd end up at 4 months. And I don't know that I was ever under time in the entire, 5 years I built machines within that company. So, and I noticed kind of the same thing at Wright. We were generally, a quote would be put together, and, there would be a certain amount of time, but then there would be ECOs and things like that. And of course the schedule would slip. So the original quoted time, it seemed like it was rarely true. But how often would you say everything was exactly as originally quoted as far as time?
Oh my goodness, less than 40%.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the, and I think we had this discussion in the previous thing. There are a lot of very intelligent young engineers available today, mechanically, electrically, software engineers. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of exposure. So they might be, very, very comfortable. Hypothetically, you're writing Rockwell PLC code for automotive applications, but automotive is a very cyclical market. So, like, for example, this year, 2020 and 2021, there's been a number of publications put out that companies in the systems integration business that do material handling, that do automotive and such, their bookings are significantly off because projects are being postponed, projects are being delayed. They're not being canceled, they're just being delayed. And they don't have any backfill for that, so they end up, laying people off. The company Cookville is a good example. Their revenues are down significantly because the automotive related. It's going to come back. Everybody's predicting that in Q3 and Q4 this year. A lot of those projects that were put on hold or delayed are going to come back to life. And it's going to be an opposite problem. Now you've gone from famine to feast. And how do you get the resources back to handle this new surge of business? You've got to have diversification. You've got to have more than a niche market. You cannot just be in automotive. You've got to have the ability to service the food industry, to service the healthcare industry. But the younger, smart people don't have that exposure. And as soon as you say, hey, we got this opportunity to build point-of-care test kits for a Loom or for Puritan or something like that, they try to force their comfort zone from automotive onto that application. And it doesn't work. It's totally different. It's a different language. It's different skill sets. And it's not that they can't do it. They've just not been exposed to it. So one of the things that I see today is there's a lack of innovation in a lot of these younger people. And I don't know if it's because they get beat up because there's margin erosion or they just don't have time to go to training, but they want to stick solely in their comfort zone. And if you're recommending using a precise automation robot and they've never worked with one, they've only done FANUC, they're going to do everything in their power to use a FANUC, even though the FANUC won't work. And that's the predicament I see today, is that you've got to understand that an engineer is not an engineer is not an engineer. You've got to have people on your staff that are comfortable in these different markets.
So how often do some of those big companies go out and contract people who do have that skill set?
To my knowledge, not very often, because those people aren't available. The biggest thing is today is, I mean, if you went out and you tried to hire today a validation engineer so that you could do internal validation on healthcare projects, you can't find them. If you went out today and tried to find a controls engineer that was very comfortable with process-related things, not discrete part manufacturing, but starting to get into PID loops and starting to get into continuous motion or things of that nature, you can't find them. And it has to do, in my personal opinion, a lot to do with the educational system. It has to do with the companies just aren't doing enough in apprenticeships and mentoring. We need more STEM programs. We need more mentoring. And they just don't take the time to do that. And I saw Dan was covering his face. I don't know if that touched home.
Our first webinar here back when I started the Automation Academy was a guy named Carlos Colon. And he came from a background of validation and serialization. And so he started this little company, mostly doing, vision systems and things like that and tracking parts through the medical device. But he's formed a pretty good network down in Tampa of a bunch of people that are involved in the healthcare industry and handle different parts of it, validation, and they're very familiar with that kind of stuff. And he seemed to have that kind of time, but he didn't have the sales tools. So he wouldn't know, for instance, about like a JR or somebody, right? He wouldn't know how to get in touch with them. But I think, I guess now, what do they call it? The gig economy. There's probably a lot of people out there that are contracting, that are available for that kind of thing. But I don't know that they can get out there. I think people like Aerotech and some of the recruiters probably know, I see it on LinkedIn all the time. They probably know some of those people that are in those different areas and advertising on LinkedIn or, chiming in on conversations or whatever. That might be a resource for some of those big companies to grab them if they pay enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a reluctance as well in the industry to use other companies for fear of they might be a competitor. And your machine shop might be very busy and can't get all the parts through. So, another machine shop down the road, but there's a reluctance to use them solely from the perspective of, they could be a competitor. I don't know how you get around that.
That's interesting. Oh, I'll tell you what, I've learned a lot from this meeting. Like I said, my next, I guess, course, my next module is going to be on all this quoting and machine specking and all that kind of thing. And I'm using that food thing that I'm doing is still live, so I'm using some of my experience with that. But again, they've asked me to do some things that are out of my comfort zone, that are not, how am I going to do this? I'm really not an applications guy, right? I'm mostly I'm more on the fabrication and the controls design and all that kind of part of it. And yet I'm finding myself having to recommend, things to some of these people, and hopefully going to put it together in a little more codified structure than everything being a swag.
Yeah. And there's, what I'm finding as well, Frank, is that there's a resource of a lot of retired people out there right now that if you need help in a specific area, don't want to work full time anymore. But if you've got an application and you just need some help concepting, or you need some help on a design of one particular station, they're willing to dive in and help you. And that type of networking, I think, is important to this business overall, to know how to get in touch with those kind of people. And I don't think LinkedIn is the right place for that, but it might be something that you would consider through your academy here to start just a reference library of people that, here's Vern Steiner, and he's very good with continuous motion or high-speed applications, and here's his email and here's his phone number if you need somebody.
Yeah, it's interesting, as I attend this thing called the Membership Academy, which tells you how to make membership sites, right? Which is kind of where what the Automation Academy is. But there's also apparently there's another group that's lists, list websites. In other words, people put together resources like that, and then they sell access to that kind of resource.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's a whole academy associated with that too, the list building, and where do you get the resources for those lists, and then people pay to join those lists of people, right? Because they get recommendations from within that list, or from outside, or whatever. So yeah, that's a whole nother web entity, the list website. So this webinar was very meaningful. I learned a lot from it, and then we are going to have another one on March 4th. I'm taking these as they go, because I said that I was going to have one every 2 weeks, even if I don't have a subject necessarily for the next webinar. March 4th is the next one, which is almost the anniversary of the tornado last year, which was March 3rd, that took out my office. So I'll be having a webinar the day after my 1-year tornado anniversary. So one of the couple of things I'm working on right now, NTH has asked me to help them put together a troubleshooting course for both internal use and for a customer. So I'm looking for input on, how can you do that without selling somebody a great big physical troubleshooting setup, right, for wiring and things like that? Do they build their own, or do you provide them something? Of course, NTH in their own facility has these relay panels and all kinds of things that they use, but for their customer, I'm not sure if they're wanting to sell them a training kit or what. And then also when it comes time to troubleshooting in the PLC, I'm building a bunch of simulations. So that's working out really well, where you can run a touch screen, you can watch a fake machine running, and all of a sudden when that machine stops running, you can dig into the program and find out what stopped it. So I may do the next webinar on something like that, depending on what comes up. But I want to stick with the mastering the machine theme I guess that's part of my goal with this is providing more of the systems integration background, within the Automation Academy. So.
Okay. Let me know how I can help. I enjoy it. It's fun. Okay.
Well, thank you, Doug. And
Thank you.
like I said, I'm not sure what the next webinar will be about, but for all of you who do see this on recording, please join the Automation Academy. And I will be posting this on YouTube. And of course, I post all the webinars within the Academy itself, so people can go in there and browse back and look at all the old videos. But thanks a lot, Doug. I appreciate it.
Frank, have a good day.
Yep, you too.
Nice
Thanks.
weekend. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.